This is another type of the scorecard for Vietnam, where you look at a particular type of indicators. So you could create your own scorecard with the indicators that you want, like smart indicators, most likely. And then you will take those indicators and you will see over time what's your targets and what your results. So you can use that as a scorecard. Now, if we go back to the logical framework that we were at the beginning, and we take it and we apply it to the public-private dialogue, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to incorporate all the information that we learned until now on the PPD evaluation wheel, on the reform process table, on the actual outputs. And we're going to assess two factors: how well the PPD is working and what the PPD is doing or delivering. And so you could have different components where you have your activities, your expected output, your expected outcome, and your expected impact. And first, you take one component, which is the creation or the setup or the re-engineering or the improvement of the PPD process itself. And the second component is the promotion of policy reform through the PPD mechanism. And that could be the promotion of competitiveness actions as well through the PPD mechanism. So you're looking at the process and you're looking at what comes out of it in terms of policy reform. So the activities here, what we recommend, you could say a number of new laws or regulation or amendments that were drafted, a number of procedures that were recommended for improvement or elimination, or number of practices, number of workshops, training, events, seminars, conference, working groups meetings, number of participants in those working group meetings, number of women, for instance, or number of reports that were issued by the dialogue process. These are all activities. And what do you have afterwards? What are the expected output of this? Well, if you look at the first component, you're talking about a new or improved public-private dialogue mechanism. And if you decide to put a public-private dialogue together, you say, well, it's operating at some point. It's operating where a working group is formed, when the secretariat is formed, and they have started to put a regulation to put the dialogue in place. The government has actually enacted a decree that said they will talk with the private sector in that way. So that's something you can measure. You can also measure on the outcomes, very importantly, for these components, the impact of the PPD on the reform process. So you look at the change in the reform process table score. You can look at the ratio. You can take that from your PPD scorecard, and you can look at the number of reforms put forward for enactment by the PPD that were enacted. You can look at the enactment rate of the reform, and you can see by taking those two numbers, the improved enactment rate, the number of reforms put forward for enactment, and then a number of reforms that were put forward for enactment that were enacted, you get a ratio, so you could put your ratio right there. And of course, if you go one step above, the improvement in the application of the PPD Charter of Good Practice by the institutional mechanism. And that's a change in the score obtained in the PPD evaluation wheel over time. So this first component is purely in terms of how well is the PPD organized. Use the evaluation wheel, use the PPD scorecard to look at the enactment rate of reform proposed by the PPD, and you look at the impact on the reform process with the reform process table. But more important than that, because PPD is not an end in itself, it's only a mean to something, is the reforms that were promoted. And here you look at the number of PPD-sponsored reformed or actions or initiatives that were proposed for enactment, and the number of reform initiatives which were directly supported by the PPD, and eventually look into the impact of those. And what's the expected impact? One number that we have used consistently over time, and the IFC has done that a lot, is to look at the value of aggregated private sector savings from the recommended changes. But you can use any other big impact number that you want. I was saying before the number of yield per hectare, the amount of water saved for an agricultural partnership, the reduction in child mortality if it's a health partnership, number of kids immunized as an outcome, and then the mortality from a particular disease. So you can use all this as an impact, and that's what matters, of course, right? You don't want to do a PPD just that it's beautiful and it exists. You want it to actually produce something, produce action and initiative that's going to result into something, and that's what matters. And yes, you have some cases where you have totally disorganized dialogue processes and they're not professionalized and they do great stuff, but over time it's hard to sustain. That's why we're putting an emphasis on the fact that it needs to be well organized and well thought of, because we see a strong correlation between those dialogue processes that are well organized and well thought of and the one that actually produce good results. So we have a logical framework, and it's down there. You can actually download it, but you can also create one that makes more sense for the particular reform you're working on, so you can do that as an exercise by taking some time from the Word document we give you below, which is empty, and you'll be able to actually make your own logical framework. Now, I want to talk about evaluating the impact, which is a particular component that's important. When you do impact evaluation, a lot of people have talked about before and after evaluation. How was it before and how was it after? And if I compare just before and after, that's good enough to know if my thing worked, if that public-private dialogue created something good. Well, in a sense, yes, but in a sense, no, because you don't know what were the factors that also influence the impact. And it's very hard to look at the attribution of what caused the impact, what were the chain of events. And it's not just one chain of events. There is like 2,000 chain of events happening at the same time. So it's very hard to say, well, this happened just because of us. And so people have used different type of designs to do evaluation. You have non-experimental designs, you have quasi-experimental or experimental designs. Of course, you have all heard about the medical trials. So you give a medicine to 200 people, but randomly in those 200 people, you're going to select 100 that are eligible for the medicine, but you're going to give them randomly. It's a randomized trial. Randomly, you're going to give them a placebo, which is a fake medicine. It looks like the other one, but there is no medicine inside. And so you're going to see between those two populations that had the same condition, and randomly you selected to give treatment to some and treatment not to others, and you see what happened, and you see if the one that had treatment have a better outcome than the others. And so this is a randomized trial. Well, people like it, of course, but it's very hard to do, and there are solution in between that you can use. But I'm not going into detail of all this, but when you're dealing with those kind of policy reform proposals or competitiveness actions that you push through a public-private dialogue, it's very hard to say, what was the counterfactual? If we had not done this, what would have happened? We deal with it a little bit with the reform process table, but not completely. So it's very hard to use that purely for an impact evaluation. You know, we've done some impact evaluation. For instance, I was talking to you about the Mekong PPD evaluation. We did a number of impact evaluation over time, about 5 different ones, looking at roughly about 35 or 40 different partnerships over the years. On this one particularly, there were more than 1,000 documents that were cataloged, that were indexed, that were reviewed, 246 companies surveyed, some participating in the PPD, some not. A lot of senior experts interviewed, a lot of database management to keep the record and to analyze those. So an impact evaluation is something that's quite serious. It has to be done possibly independently if you can do it. We've done it in an independent fashion here, but you can self-assess, of course, your impact, but it's better if someone else looks at all those documents and try to get proof of the things that happen, and then can backtrack to why it happened and how it happened, and can give some attribution. This is some of the example of an impact evaluation that was done in the Mekong. You can see some numbers that came out of this evaluation. For instance, you could see that the input into the partnership by the private sector was larger, of $950,000 per year, was larger than the input into the partnership in financial terms given by the donors. You can see that it created about 300 plus million of private sector savings. And you can see that if you compare the amount of dollar invested into these three partnerships and the amount of private sector savings that it resulted into, you have a return on investment of about 1 to 291. So very effective partnership in that case. But these are examples of things you can do with an impact evaluation. But you cannot do this without collecting baseline data, of course, about what was the situation before the public-private dialogue got into place and started to try to do something about it. Collecting baseline data is crucial, and in order to do this, you could go online. You can look a lot of database. There is first at the World Bank. There is tons of data that you can use about the country where you are, about the sector that you're operating into. I'm sure there are statistical information that you can find online. And as an exercise, we ask people to go online now and try to get a lot of baseline data about one particular reform that you're interested into, and try to get as much as you can.